afterwards. So good morning, one and all, and welcome to Developing Your Cash Flow Projection. This workshop is sponsored in part by the Maine Technology Institute, and we very much appreciate their support, not only for our organization here at SCORE, but also for so many other entrepreneurs in Maine, the technology sphere. SCORE is also supported by the Small Business Administration, so we also thank them on a regular basis for their support of our organization. I'll apologize in advance. I'm in the throes of a cold, so I may need to stop and cough occasionally, but hopefully not too often. I invite you to please ask questions as they arise, in part because if you have a question, others probably have the same. So don't be bashful, jump in, either unmute yourself and ask the question yourself, or you're welcome to post it in the chat. Either way is fine. I will do my best to address them in a timely fashion. So, cash flow. What is it? Well, it is the flow of cash in a business. A business can be having a net cash outflow, meaning that your bank balance is going down and down, or a net cash inflow, meaning that your bank balance is rising. A positive cash flow, meaning cash is growing, allows your business to survive, allows you to pay compensation to owners and staff, allows you to generate a return on investment for investors in your business. It allows you to grow because growth often requires cash. A positive cash flow will make it much easier to obtain a loan because lenders are counting on positive cash flow to help you repay a loan. And if you have a positive cash flow and a good history of positive cash flow for the past, say, year or two, if you foresee that you might need a loan in order to ensure that your cash balance stays at an acceptable level going in the future, the best time to apply for a loan is usually before you need it. Get that lending facility in place while your financials all look strong, because that's the time that the bank will look at you and say, oh yes, you have the capability of supporting this loan that we're proposing. The major influences on your cash flow are, first of all, your profits. If you are profitable, or if you're a nonprofit, if your net assets are increasing, that is the primary source of cash flow for most businesses. However, there are a number of other things that also affect a business's cash flow. A change in inventory levels, for example. If you are building your inventory in anticipation of the holiday season or the summer season, that requires cash. You're going to be spending a lot of cash and trading it for inventory so that you have the inventory you need. Or towards the end of the holiday season, when you're no longer frantically buying inventory and you've sold off most of your inventory, your cash balance will probably be higher than normal. So changes in inventory levels often have a large impact on your cash balance, and therefore a growing inventory level tends to hurt your cash flow, and a shrinking inventory level tends to help your cash flow. In the same vein, accounts receivable, which are funds that your customers owe you, if accounts receivable go up, that means that you have sales for which you have not received the cash. So if you are using accrual accounting, that means you'd have profits, but you haven't received the cash for them yet. So when accounts receivable goes up, that hurts your cash balance. When it goes down, it helps your cash balance. Similarly, accounts payable works the same way. That's money you owe other companies. If accounts payable goes up, that helps your cash balance. and if accounts payable goes down, that hurts your cash balance. Anytime you have capital expenses, if you are purchasing anything that you quote unquote capitalize, meaning you are going to add it to your balance sheet at cost, but you are not going to treat the entire cost as an expense in this year. Instead, you're going to depreciate it over its useful life. Well, that becomes something that is not shown as an expense. Part of it will sneak into your depreciation expense for the year, but most of it just disappears from your cash without reducing profits. And so capital expenses tend to reduce your cash levels. Similarly, if you sell assets that you've had for years, that will tend to help your cash. If you pay down debt, that will use up cash, so that'll hurt your cash. But also, every monthly payment you make on any debt that you have usually has two components, an interest component and a principal component. The interest component reduces your profits, but the principal component does not, because you're just giving money the bank gave to you back to them. So it's not an expense. So every principal payment you make on debt will reduce your cash compared to what your profits might have indicated. And lastly, if you take owner's draws, if you as the owner draw money out of the company, that obviously is going to reduce your cash. Or if you as the owner invest your money back in the company, that will increase your cash. Just about every account on your balance sheet will have an impact on your cash in one way or another. But these are the ones that tend to have the largest impact on people's cash flows. And I mention these here to say, when you're developing a cash flow forecast, you don't need to worry about every last penny because it's a forecast. It's going to be wrong, and that's okay. You just want it to be close. You want it to be, as we used to say in the consulting industry, you want it to be directionally accurate. If you predict that cash is going up, then you want your cash to go up. If it doesn't quite go up by the exact amount that you predicted, that's okay. It still went up. But if your prediction is in the wrong direction, okay, that's bad. So let's start getting down into the details of the process of forecasting. First of all, as you come up with the cash flow forecast, there are going to be two components to it, the cash inflows and the cash outflows. Now, most of the cash inflows are likely to be a result of revenues that your organization has, sales, if you will. I recommend that you forecast your revenues first. And the reason for that is that if you forecast your expenses first and you see what your total expenses are likely to be, it's miraculous how often your revenue forecast will end up slightly exceeding your forecasted expenses. In other words, there's a fair amount of opinion and bias that can creep into forecasts. And if you forecast revenues first, you're less likely to have your forecast biased by what you know your expenses total. We're all subject to this, so it's nothing personal, but in general, try to forecast revenues first and then forecast expenses. The other reason this is helpful is if you're growing, for example, you may need to have some extra expenses to help prepare you for that growth in your revenues. And planning for revenue growth is also a very important thing to do. If it surprises you, it can hurt you as a business. So as we start to look at forecasting your revenues, I want to add some cautions. First of all, every business is likely to forecast revenue in a slightly different way. You and your competitor might forecast it pretty similarly, but you and a business that's in a different industry may have very different approaches to forecasting your revenue, and that's okay. So the revenue forecasting side of things is often what I see people tweak or customize the most to better fit their business. Forecasting revenue is much easier for some kinds of businesses than it is for others. That's okay. I get that. If you find it challenging, you have a lot of company. Um, that's why SCORE mentors are here to help you with that process if you wish. Um, and I also might suggest that you may wish to forecast your revenues in a completely separate spreadsheet from the one you use to forecast your cash flow. So you may have some relatively complex way of forecasting your revenues, product line by product line, or business area by business area, that adds up to some total revenue number. And that total revenue number might be what you put at the top of your cash flow forecast. And the reason for that is, yes, forecasting revenues can get complex, but that particular complexity, if it takes up the first 3 pages of your cash flow forecast, makes the cash flow forecast too complex to convey to others. The point is to have it be something that's relatively quick and simple to get a 1,000-foot overview of, so that you can get a sense of what is affecting your cash flow as a business. And lastly, as I sort of said a minute ago, some encouragement. No forecast is ever going to be 100% correct. So you are not going to be right. You're also going, there's a huge probability you're going to be wrong in your forecast. What does that mean? Well, that may mean that your number isn't spot on to the penny, but in general, depending on the size of your business, if you're within X $100 or X $1,000, your forecast is probably good enough. And I see Jen adds that she's also interested in handling startup cash flow when cash is quite low and there's lots and lots of different kinds of debt. So yes, I will talk about that in a minute when I get to the cash flow spreadsheet that I'm going to show you. So when forecasting, particularly forecasting revenues, I recommend you use third-party data when possible, meaning if you can base some of your data on data generated by other people as opposed to just by yourself, that will tend to make your forecast more credible if you're presenting it outside of your company, say to lenders or to investors. So when practical, do try to base your forecast, at least in part, upon third-party data and cite that data in your forecast. Secondly, use reasonable assumptions. Everybody is alternately optimistic and pessimistic about their business. That's perfectly normal. Try to find an assumption that you think most other people will find reasonable. So if you're going to present your information to a bank and you think you might grow 120% next year at best and 30% at worst, well, then maybe you pick something in between as what you present to the bank. Your greatest hopes and your worst fears don't usually come to pass. It's usually something in between. And so take a similar approach to your forecast. And whenever you do make an assumption, document it as part of your forecast. So you might, on the right of your forecast, have a little column which says assumed 5% sales growth, because that's the industry growth cited in this magazine article or newspaper report or on this website for the industry. And that's enough. It doesn't have to be chapter and verse. It just has to be something that will help you find it again in the future when you forget what you based your forecast on, which happens, or helps others better understand how you came up with your number. Kent asks, what percentage of revenue forecast should be expected to be expected? What percentage of revenue forecast should be expected should be expected? I'm not certain I fully understand your question. You should be trying to forecast all of your revenues as best you can from all of your likely business areas. Some sections you might be less certain of than others, and so there'd be a greater variability to the numbers that you might expect. That's okay. Um, Once again, try to pick something in the middle, but as we'll talk about a bit later, you might also want to use multiple scenarios where you have your optimistic scenario and your pessimistic scenario, and then your best guess forecast becomes something in between the two. I hope that answers your question. So there are two approaches to forecasting revenues. The first is top down, and the second is bottom up. A top down forecast starts from the market you serve. How big is it? How many competitors do I have? And from that, what do I think my market share is, or what do I know my market share is? And size of the market times your share should equal your expected revenues. That requires some outside research, often through databases or libraries or publications or industry studies or trade association publications. So this is something that I generally suggest you might do at a later date once you've had a chance to do that research. If I did an example today, it would inevitably be not for your industry. So I'm going to focus on a bottom-up forecast today. Bottom-up forecast starts by analyzing your capacity. If you were operating at full capacity, how much could you do? How much would that sell for? But most people don't necessarily operate at full capacity. Sometimes you do, but sometimes you don't. And so it's important to think about what your average capacity utilization might be and what your average sale might be. And then from that, you can build an estimate from the bottom up of if you're operating at your average capacity utilization, how much revenue might you generate? And that's what we'll look at here today. So start by thinking about what is your capacity. What do I mean by that? Well, if you were so busy that you had to decline some business because you just couldn't do it, what is it about your business that would limit your revenues? What is constraining your capacity? Is it the number of tables or chairs if you're a restaurant or a school? Is it the number of clients that fit into your studio if you're a gym or a yoga instructor? Is it the number of staff that you have or their availability? Is it equipment capacities? Your machinery only produces so much. Um, the exact things that are the ultimate limit to your capacity vary a great deal from one business to another. And so it's really important to think about, okay, yeah, I've got 3 or 4 things that could limit my capacity, but which one actually does? You might have 10 cash registers, but if you can only hire 2 cashiers because of labor shortages, then it's your staff that's limiting your capacity. On the other hand, if you've got tons of staff but only 2 cash registers, maybe the number of cash registers is what's limiting your capacity. So think about that as it applies to your business. The next question is, what percentage of your capacity do you tend to utilize on average? Now, this chart on the left shows, a line that bounces up and down a lot. That's pretty typical of many businesses, that some months will see much higher capacity utilization than others. In other words, some months you're busy, some months you're not.
Hey, good morning. There she is.
Yes, good morning.
Miss Pretty Young Thing. How's it going?
Oops, you're not talking to
Just
me. Never
checking in
mind.
on you.
I
Making
will.
sure, no cat.
Okay. Um, so your capacity utilization is likely to cycle throughout each year seasonally. That's totally normal. It may also vary quite a bit depending on what the economy is doing at the moment, and that's also normal. So look at that over time, and while you could just take an annual average and use that to forecast your annual revenues, when you're doing a cash flow forecast, you probably want to forecast things on a month by month basis. So I would encourage you to try to dig down into what your capacity utilization is each month, um, and to forecast it on a month by month basis, because your cash needs in your busy season are going to be very different from your cash needs in your slow season, and your cash flow forecast is going to help you figure out what they are. So look at your customer buying patterns, look at the forecast for the economy, look at your maintenance and administrative needs. For example, if you have to shut your equipment down for 2 weeks every year in order to do preventative maintenance, or you shut your building down for 2 weeks every year to strip and clean the floors, or we're all hands on deck doing the audit for a month um, at the end of each fiscal year, and therefore we tend to not get a lot of other stuff done, and maybe our revenues go down as a result. Um, I don't know. There could be any number of reasons why your capacity utilization might vary from month to month, but do try to look back over your history if you have a history. If you're a brand new company starting up, try thinking about how seasonal you expect your revenues to be looking forward, and estimate your capacity utilization month by month for the next 12 to 24 months. The next question is, how much revenue do you tend to get per unit of capacity? So depending on how you measure your capacity, it could be number of clients, number of seats, number of tables, number of staff, uh, or number of certain type of staff, such as the folks manning your cash registers, or per machine hour. I don't know. However you measure your capacity, what is the average revenue you tend to get per unit of capacity that's used? And you can use that then to multiply by the capacity you expect to be used each month to come up with a revenue estimate for that month. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The first one from my own background, because I've been a math tutor, um, looking at a bottom-up way of estimating how much a math tutor might earn. I usually was working with middle and high school students, so I look at my calendar and I tended to have about 18 time slots available per week. Usually that's after school, so 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, maybe something after dinner, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. Times, well, that's probably only 4 days a week because most students don't want to meet on Friday nights or weekends. And so that's how I came up with only 18 time slots per week. Um, on average, they were booked about 90% of the time. So that's my average capacity utilization. I billed at $50 an hour. So to calculate my anticipated revenue, 18 time slots times 90% of that are actually used, times $50 an hour says $810 per week, times an average of 4.35 weeks per month gives me a revenue estimate of $3,500 per month. But then I think about, well, my business is seasonal. And in the summer, not many students want to work on math. So maybe I only see 4 students a week during the summer. So during the summer months, it would be 4 times $50 times 4.35, or $868 per month. And so here are 2 monthly revenue estimates for a tutoring business done using a bottom-up approach. On the other hand, suppose it was an office cleaning business. So I have enough people, 4 people, to have 2 cleaning crews with, say, 2 people in each crew. Excuse me. Those 4 people work 40 hours a week. a standard work week. And suppose I found that my crew can clean about 3,000 square feet per hour. However, in analyzing some jobs we've done, I find that the crew tends to actually only spend about 75% of his time cleaning because they have to get from our shop to the site to be cleaned. They have to get back. They take a coffee break occasionally, all that sort of stuff. So between travel time and just time not spent cleaning, it's actually only 75% of the time that's spent cleaning. I typically bill clients at about $15 per square foot to clean their office space. Sorry, $15, 15 cents per square foot. Um, and so the calculation here becomes 2 crews times 40 hours. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Um, 2 crews times 40 hours a week that they spend cleaning times 75% of the time that's actually spent cleaning times $3,000 times the 15 cents per square foot. Sorry, times 3,000 square feet times 15 cents a square foot. So the 3,000 times 15 is the revenue I get for cleaning 3,000 square feet. And that's how much somebody can clean per hour, assuming they're working full time. But while I'm paying them for 40 hours a week, they're only cleaning for 75% of that time. And I have 2 crews doing that. So that adds up to about $27,000 per week. Times 4.35 weeks per month, it would be $117,000 a month that I might expect in revenues. Now, remember what I said a little while ago about having different scenarios. This might be an optimistic scenario. So let's look at a pessimistic scenario, or a slightly less optimistic scenario, if you will. What if, instead of having my crew work 40 hours, because they have kids in school, because they got parents to take care of, they really only want to work 30 hours a week because they have other obligations that they need to worry about in their lives. So maybe I can only get 30 hours a week out of them instead of 40. And maybe they're not terribly efficient because they're sort of new to this. So maybe they only clean 2,500 square feet instead of 3,000 square feet per hour. And maybe they only spend 70% of their time cleaning because the travel times are longer this year than they were last year. Well, doing the same calculation comes up with just shy of $16,000 a week, or $117,000 per month versus, sorry, what am I saying? Or 68,000 per month versus 117,000 per month in the previous slide. So, whoa, 70,000 a month compared to 117,000 per month. Big difference. When I first put this slide together, that was a bigger difference than my gut feel expected. That's the reason for looking at some of these scenarios, to see how if things land on the slightly pessimistic side, how much that could hurt your revenues. Moral of the story is, which of these 2 forecasts should I use? Or perhaps I should use something in between. In general, I would recommend that you be a little conservative. Do not use your most optimistic projection because most people are not going to believe it. If you want to present something as convincing to a lender or an investor, you'd be better off choosing some numbers that show that you can pay the debt service even if you don't make your optimistic numbers. And if you do happen to make your optimistic numbers and exceed them, well, then you're a hero because you'll have more money to devote to servicing your debt. So having a projection that is not your most optimistic one is often a good thing. I'm not saying make it pessimistic. I'm just saying back off from your most optimistic scenario. So here is an example of a cash flow template. There are many ways of laying it out. There's no one way you have to do it. But I wanted to give you a link to this in the chat here. So let's see, there's the chat window. And so here is a link to the SCORE website, which will allow you to download the spreadsheet. And in general, this is a rough format that is approximately what just about every cash flow forecast you see will look like. At the top, it shows cash inflows. At the bottom, it shows cash outflows. So at the very top here, we have two sections, one showing operating income receipts and the next showing capital inflow receipts. So operating income are things that come from your operating your business, such as sales or past sales where the customer finally paid for what they bought. And then capital inflows are cash that you receive either from getting a new loan or perhaps an investor investing in your business. It could also be things like you're selling old equipment that you're not using anymore. Then you get down to the second half, you have operating expenses. These are the expenses that you incurred to generate all of your operating income. So they're tightly associated with one another. And then at the bottom, you have capital expenses for things that happen occasionally. They tend to be larger dollar items, but these are things which are not considered expenses. So to some extent, the capital items are somewhat linked to uh, these cash receipts in that you might, for example, receive a loan in order to help pay for some new equipment. The reason these are divided out this way is so that at the top, I can end up with a total inflows number. And at the bottom, I can end up with a total outflows number. And then I can subtract the two to end up with a number which, if I take my starting cash up here and subtract, starting cash plus inflows minus outflows will give me my ending cash. It's the ending cash number down here in blue that you want to follow. Now, so the question was asked earlier about what if you're a startup business? Well, if you're a startup business, chances are what's going to be happening is you are not going to be having any revenues for your first few months. So these cells will probably be empty. On the other hand, you will be purchasing inventory and you may be paying for insurance and you may have to pay some wages. And so you'll probably see a lot of things down in here, even though you've got a great big zero up above under revenue. And then at some point you begin operating. And when you begin operating, you'll start to see revenues appearing up here. And at the same time, your pattern of expenses down here is likely to change as it moves towards becoming more of your typical operating expenses once you're in business. So in effect, what I'm saying is that on this spreadsheet, you can sort of draw a line here, and this is the point between your startup on the left and your beginning of operations on the right. In reality, it's not going to be a hard and fast line. In reality, some startup expenses are going to continue after you begin operating. Some operating revenues will happen sooner than others, and so it gets a little blurry. It's pretty easy to think about the startup only phase and pretty easy to think about the fully operating only phase later on. And then the question becomes, how do you blur from one end to the other? Once again, working with somebody else can help do that. So here at SCORE, we're happy to help you do that if you wish us to. Anyhow, so let me continue on to talk about this. First of all, as you play with this template, or whichever one you use, but if you choose to use this one, um, all the cells that had a green background, which you'll notice are most of them, are ones that you're welcome to modify. This includes all the labels on the left. So all those expense categories, those aren't required expense categories. Those are just suggestions. And so you will probably wish to modify those expense labels to better reflect the expenses that your business typically incurs. Furthermore, the starting month at the very top, if you look up here where it says January 23, the green cell underneath it, where you put your beginning cash balance, you can also modify the January 23 cell to be, say, in this case, January 25. And the minute you do that, all the cells to the right will change to be successive months. So even that little green cell up there is something that you can change and will be useful. Um, Any cells with white or blue backgrounds are calculated for you. So, for example, the cells in blue at the bottom with your ending cash balance or the totals are all calculated for you. So, in general, you probably don't want to be changing those unless you are well versed in Excel formulas and know that you won't be introducing any errors into the spreadsheet. So, to get started with this, estimate your bottom-up revenues in something like the process I described earlier. Think about whether they will be steady or grow or be seasonal, and be ready to take your initial estimate and then bump it higher or lower depending on the month. Then do your top-down research. Figure out how big a market are you serving. Maybe it's just for the town you live in. Maybe it's for the region you live in. Maybe it's nationally. Look at how often your customers purchase. Look at the number of competitors you have and how busy they are. Try to estimate your market share, and then look at what's going to happen to the size of your market. Is the market you serve growing or flat or shrinking? Use that along with your market share and a formula, something along the lines of number of customers in the market times your share of the market would be the number of customers you get, times their average purchase, times the number of purchases per month they make. Some businesses that might be one, others it might be once a day. That would be a way of estimating your top-down revenues. And then compare your top-down number to your bottom-up number. And this comparison is always interesting because it helps you figure out whether your revenue is more likely to be limited by your capacity or by your share of the market or the size of the market. The smaller of the two forecasts is the one that is more likely to happen. So think about why one was smaller than the other, and is there something you can or wish to do about that? But when you turn to forecast your revenues, you probably want to use either your smaller forecast or something a little smaller than that if you want to be slightly conservative in your forecast. So pick a revenue projection that you feel you can defend as being reasonable. And then think about, okay, yes, this is when I'm making the sale, but am I going to get the money then? If you've offered terms to your customers, allowing them to pay in 2 weeks or in a month after shipment, when are you going to get the money? Some pay more quickly, some pay at the last minute. You will want to take any terms you've offered your customers into account in your cash flow forecast. Because up until now, I've been talking about revenue. When do you expect to get what in revenue? Well, revenue can just mean that you've made the sale. It does not necessarily mean you received the cash from the sale. Since this is a cash flow forecast, if you think you're going to sell $1,000 this month, but you don't expect to receive that $1,000 until next month because you offer terms to your customers, then you should put that $1,000 in under next month's receipts, not this month's, because this is a cash flow forecast, not an income statement forecast. So that's a very important point. Your cash flow will often differ from your from your profits. Profit does not equal cash flow in many businesses. Sometimes it will, but in general, your cash flow predicts how your bank balance is going to change. And in many businesses that use accrual accounting, you may find that your profits differ from your cash flow, sometimes quite significantly. And that's the reason to use cash flow forecasts to make sure you don't unexpectedly run out of cash. So, if you're potentially running low on cash, you want to look at other possible sources of cash. So now that you've entered your revenues, which is usually most people's major source of cash when they're operating, what other sources of cash might you have? Well, investments in your business by an owner or by a partner might add cash to your business. And if you expect to receive them, then add them to the spreadsheet in that second section at the top that I highlighted earlier. If you receive a new loan or you expand an existing loan, that would be another source of cash. And you should put that down in your cash flow forecast in the month that you expect to receive the loan proceeds. In many cases, loan proceeds may go right back out the door as you buy capital assets or something. Okay, such is life, but include both the receipts and the expenses in the month that you expect to incur them. If you are applying for grants or participating in competitions, that would be another source of funding. Or maybe you're trying crowdfunding, and that could be another source of funding. All of those could go in the second section of cash inflows at the top of the spreadsheet. And so enter any that apply to your business into the template in this second section here at the top under capital inflows. We only allowed 2 lines for that. If you have other sources, you could get more specific, but you could also lump things together and just call it, loans versus other kinds of sources of cash. Your call. Okay. We're now done with forecasting your revenues. Moving on to expenses. Just a reminder, the expense labels on the spreadsheet we just saw are only those reminders. You're more than welcome to change them to labels that work better for your business. Note that some of your expenses may only occur once at startup, whereas others occur regularly and may vary with your revenues, namely your cost of goods sold. Some may vary with temperature, your utility bills. Others may be constant, like your rent. Others are only paid a couple of times a year, like your insurance. So your goal in your cash flow forecast is to accurately reflect the pattern of expenses as they actually occur in your business on a month-by-month basis. And you may wish to go to, say, a library if they have access to databases, or to your bank, and ask if they could provide you with industry ratios, typical industry ratios for your industry. So, for example, you might say, I'm a food store. What are the typical percentage of total expenses that food stores spend on staff, on insurance, on inventory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and see how your forecasted expenses compare to industry standard ratios. Doesn't mean you'll be exactly the same, but if you're very different, that's something to look into. And lastly, I just want to point out, because this is a cash flow forecast, you want to enter each expense when you expect to pay it, not when you expect to incur it. In other words, maybe you buy something this month, but you don't need to pay for it until next month because it's on your credit card. Put when you pay the credit card bill down in your cash flow forecast. Hmm. Okay. If you're already in business, well, then you have a leg up because you can use your actual history of expenses to make sure that your projections make sense. However, if you're new to starting a business, then you just have to make your best estimate as best you can. However, you can get some help in this by, for example, asking suppliers for quotes, asking insurance agent what the premium is going to be, using the industry ratios I talked about previously, or asking a potential landlord not only what the rent's going to be, but what the utilities were for the previous tenant. So if they could estimate what heating, electricity, and so on were, uh, even though that may be slightly different from you, it's a good starting point for your thinking. So your goal here is to make your best guess. Uh, don't overlook things like, if you have staff, payroll taxes, unemployment insurance, and workers' comp insurance. Don't treat just their hourly wage. Also consider the taxes, which tend to add 15% or more to the wages you pay them. And if you were profitable last year, you might need to pay estimated taxes this year. So put your needed cash for estimated taxes into your cash flow forecast, something that you would be withdrawing from the company to make estimated tax payments if you're an LLC. For each expense line, just like you looked at your revenues, for each expense line, ask yourself, should this expense be flat, the same month to month to month, or should it vary each month, seasonally, or because the economy is changing, or what? Some expenses will grow before revenues grow. If you are experiencing growth in revenues, you might need to stock up on inventory in order to support higher revenues. So your inventory expenses would grow in the months, plural perhaps, before your revenues actually grow. For various expenses, you may wish to lump some expenses together. For example, phone and internet, or all monthly software fees. You don't need to list things one by one by one. In general, for most businesses, I sort of ask myself, is this a big expense or a small expense? And forecasting is easier if I lump a bunch of small expenses together, and just give them some generic label. As long as I haven't forgotten any key things, forecasting is often easier when you work with bigger numbers. Don't forget, you're welcome to change any line labels you wish. Uh, Google can also be helpful, particularly in these days of AI. You can say, what are typical expense ratios for my type of business? And Google may give you a bunch of answers there. How cool is that? Now, the good news with expense forecasts is that most expense forecasts tend to be within 10% of reality, because while you're probably too high on one, you're probably too low on the other, and those more or less cancel one another out. So expense forecasts are usually reasonably accurate, and you don't need to worry quite so much about the accuracy of your expense forecast. Revenue forecasts are harder to do and therefore are off more often. So we've just talked about mostly this part of your expense forecasts, and these are the labels which may not apply to your business, so feel free to change them if that makes it easier. Um, and so now let's move on to the bottom part of here, capital items. Um, You might be making renovations to your store. You might be buying new equipment, additional equipment, or replacing equipment. You might be trying to pay down debt above and beyond your monthly regular principal and interest payment. Or you might be taking money out of the company to pay yourself or to pay taxes that are due, like estimated taxes. All of those are fine and normal and good, but they do reduce the amount of cash in the business, and you need to make sure that the business will be left with enough cash to continue operating after you take the money out. So one frequent question I ask people is, how much money do you want to have in your bank balance that allows you to sleep well at night? That's a good number to keep in mind. And if you ever see your balance falling below that, you want to do something in advance while you have time to do something about it. So look at the blue line at the bottom of the spreadsheet, which shows your closing cash balance at the end of each month. If it's negative, you have a problem. If you have negative cash, that means you're bankrupt. So just because the cash flow forecast says this might be a negative month doesn't mean it's actually going to happen. You might be able to postpone some expenses and accelerate some revenue to avoid having it happen. But if your cash flow forecast shows a negative balance at the end of some month, that's something that you need to focus on. You need to do something to address it. If a month is not negative, but is too close to zero, then you have a concern, meaning maybe you want to try to make sure it doesn't get that close to zero. So back to the question I asked a minute ago, how close to zero do you feel is safe for your business? That's a really good number to have in mind. And obviously, it depends on the size of the business. For one business, it might be $500. For another, it might be $50,000. It depends on the scale of things in the business. Um, Look at that number and look at those numbers at the end of your spreadsheet on the bottom line here in blue, and make sure that you are never too close to zero. And if some numbers are falling in ways that surprise you or that get a little too small for a ending cash balance, then now is the time to start planning how you're going to avoid getting that close to zero. Well, now that I've asked that question, how can you improve your bottom line? There are a number of generic ways that may or may not work for your business. One is to ask customers for a deposit, if that can be done in your business. So, for example, if you're a consultant or you're an attorney will often ask for a retainer, which is essentially a deposit that they then take the money that you owe them out of. That way they know they're going to get paid. But if you do projects for people, say you're a consultant, you can say, well, this is going to be a $10,000 project. I ask for a 50% deposit in advance, or maybe it's the 30%, maybe it's the 10%. I don't know, depends on your business. But you may be in a position to ask for a deposit so that you get some money from your customer sooner than you otherwise would. If you buy something from Amazon, they ask you to enter your payment information at the time you order it, but they don't actually charge you until they ship it. Okay, that's one way of doing it, but other businesses may charge you at the time you order it. That's done. So if that can work in your industry, that's one way of getting at least some of your cash from a sale sooner, and that could help your cash flow. Secondly, control your expenses carefully, particularly fixed expenses. So a fixed expense is one that does not vary from month to month, like your rent, or say you hire an administrative assistant. That is not going to be an expense that varies with your volume of revenue. Those are what fixed expenses are, expenses that do not vary with your revenues. As you contemplate incurring an expense, ask yourself, is it going to vary with revenues the way inventory tends to, or is it going to tend to stay fixed like rent tends to? If it's going to stay fixed, think very carefully before committing yourself to a fixed expense, particularly as a new business. As a brand new business, it may make tremendous sense to, for example, rent instead of purchasing, or buy smaller quantities of things, even though it costs you more per unit, because buying a larger quantity to get the discount would shrink your cash too much. So early on, focus on staying cash positive, on generating cash each month, rather than on generating the most profit you can. Because doing that will tend to reduce the total amount of cash that goes out the door and keep your initial cash balances larger. There's no one right answer here. I'm not saying you should always rent instead of buying. I'm just saying you should consider that, or uh, don't go for the cheapest cost per unit of something you're buying. Go for something that keeps some of your powder dry, that minimizes your cash outlay so that you've got more cash sitting in your bank account still to use in surprise areas that come up in your business. If you can, try to buy things that you buy for your business on terms. In other words, ask your vendors, hey, can I pay you 2 weeks or a month after I receive it or after you ship it? In many cases, as a new business, vendors may not give you terms. But once you've been buying for them regularly and paying them on time, you're more than welcome to say, hey, I've been a good customer of yours for 6 months now. Would you be willing to consider giving me terms? Because that will help me finance my growth by giving me the money for 2 weeks or 4 weeks more than I otherwise would have it, which could make all the difference as my business grows. And why would they want to do that? Because if they support you in your growth, they will get more business from you in the future. As a new business with no track history, they may be reluctant to offer you terms, but if you're buying in volume, maybe you can ask for a discount. Your business cannot run out of cash. So if your cash need is seasonal, only a couple of months a year is cash tight, then consider asking your bank for a line of credit. A line of credit is a loan that typically is repaid in a very short period of time. You might borrow money for 1, 2, 3, 4 months and then repay it all until the same time next year when you use it again. If you have a longer term need, for example, your business just needs more working capital to continue its growth, then maybe you consider getting a loan, a working capital loan from your bank. This would probably be a longer term loan, like a 2 year or a 5 year loan that you'd make a small payment on each month as you grow. And it's a loan that helps fund the growth of your business. The other part of the funding would come from the profits you're earning, and those profits would be used to repay the loan. If you're working to get to break even, which is the point where your business starts to generate cash, so you probably wouldn't qualify yet for receiving a loan, then maybe you'd qualify for a grant. Not many companies do, but if you are employing people, maybe your city has some grants available for people who are adding to their employment of city residents. Um, if you're developing a technology product, the Maine Technology Institute might have some grants that would help you out. They may not be very big initially, but it's something. The thing to be careful about with grants is uh, the effort to apply for a grant and comply with the reporting requirements of a grant may be greater than the size of the grant justifies. So look carefully at the terms of a grant in deciding whether it's something you wish to apply for or not. If you need cash as a startup and you're willing to offer some of your personal assets as collateral to a bank, then consider getting a loan. The bank could ask you for a personal guarantee. And what that means is if you have equity in your house or in your car, and you're willing to offer your house or your car as collateral for the loan, maybe that would help you get the loan for your business. Uh, do not do that unless you are willing to risk losing your house or your car or your investment account, whatever. If you are using it to guarantee a loan, you had better be very confident in your business and or willing to lose that. So don't offer a personal guarantee unless you are really confident in your business and or able to afford losing that asset that you're using to guarantee the loan. So um, that's the end of my presentation here. You will receive in your email in a few days a copy of the slide deck, um, as well as a recording of this workshop. And so you will receive those, and you will also receive a survey. So please respond to the survey that you receive. We take those very seriously. And we have many other workshops, so I invite you to visit uh, the SCORE website to find other workshops that might be of interest to you. If you're not terribly familiar with SCORE, we were founded in 1964. We offer free mentoring and workshops. Not all chapters offer free workshops. We do. Um, we are a nonprofit organization and a partner of the Small Business Administration, and we have about 320 offices throughout the United States. So we're all over the country. And if you are seeking mentors with specific backgrounds or skill sets, your lead mentor can easily ask others throughout the country to co-mentor with them. These days via Zoom, it's easy to do. And so you may be able to find some expertise specific to your industry that can help you out. If you wish to sign up for Mentor, you can scan this QR code. Um, and that's one quick way of getting a mentor, or you can connect to score.org and request a mentor through there. And that is everything that I had to say. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer questions now.
Uh, can I ask about my individual business?
Sure.
All right. So my husband's a guitar maker. We've been in business since 1998. He builds high-end guitars. They sell for $8,000 to $32,000 each. And the problem we have is um, we get a big chunk of money and then we get nothing for a long time and then a big chunk. And I don't know if you have any tips for, I run the books, I run the taxes, I do all of that, but how to better manage. Also, my husband is a brilliant guitar maker. We have a 3-year wait list, but getting them out the door is is more difficult. And I've always been trying to look for a way to predict, have it be a little more solid. So that's my case. Any tips?
Well, first of all, as a musician myself, I totally appreciate a fine instrument, um, and know full well that you can ask for deposits, obviously, as the guitar is being made, so that that final payment is not as large. And in particular, you'd have money to buy materials in advance. The problem is that many instrument makers buy material sometimes decades in advance in order to let things season properly. So, no, you don't have the customer 10 years in advance, and that's just an investment you have to make in materials. But the minute someone comes along and says, please put me on your wait list, you can say, well, there's pick a number, $100, $500 deposit to be on our wait list. When we start working on your guitar, we ask for, well, maybe it's a $5,000 additional deposit. Um, that gets a person to think, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, it's getting close now. But that also helps get you that cash maybe 3, 4, 5 months before the guitar is actually ready. And then you may have a final payment that happens either before shipment or maybe just prior to shipment, and then a final payment after shipment when they're happy with it, if you want to do that. But you're selling musicians. Musicians have a certain reputation. Maybe you want to get your money before you ship. Um, and so anyhow, so the notion of having a deposit goes a long way. The challenge that you also face is that the timing of the receipt of that final big payment is often going to shift because, oh, well, I needed to redo this thing or I wasn't quite happy with it. And um, when you have a craftsman who isn't just pumping out a standardized product, the shipment date is flexible. And that's the polite way of putting it. So uh, in your forecasts, you might wish to say, hey, just to be conservative, I'm always going to forecast that we receive the money 2 months later than you think the guitar is actually going to be ready. In reality, I'm probably going to get it 1 month later because you're usually within a month kind of thing.
Yeah.
But if I put it 2 months later in my cash flow forecast, and I know I've been conservative that way, then I can see which months I'm potentially in cash trouble and figure out, okay, do I want to let a couple more people in off the wait list because that's going to generate a few early deposits? Or can I postpone some additional purchases of new materials for 10 years from now by 2 months? Because that's going to eat up a lot of cash. It's just going to sit there for 10 years waiting for the wood to season. Um, Now, it won't be fully seasoned maybe for an extra 2 months, but right now cash is more important.
So it's holding an inventory because we have a huge inventory of wood because he sells high-end guitars. He has to have the best wood, and he's constantly looking for the exact grain. It's kind of like a wine, fine wine or whatever. Is holding an inventory uh, detrimental to our business? Should we scale
No,
it
I
down or?
mean, the nature of your business is such that if you don't have the inventory, it's a lot more expensive to try to buy that seasoned wood, and you may not be able to find what you're looking for.
True.
So what you could do is you could get a bank loan against that inventory. You could fund your inventory with a bank loan, and your justification to the bank is this is extremely valuable wood that any other luthier would give their eye teeth to purchase from us because it's already seasoned. Particularly another one in New England who had similar temperature and humidity fluctuations. Um, so uh, you might be able to get the bank to finance, I don't know, 50% of the purchase of your inventory, say.
Huh. Okay, thank you. That was helpful. Appreciate it.
Any day, that's what we're here for. The rest of it's just watching expenses as you go, but your day-to-day expenses are probably more taxes and occasional new tools that that you wore out or whatever. Um, I'd imagine it's mostly time and materials. So
100%. And he's meticulous. We can't
yeah,
hire people because they never work to his standard. But yeah, well, thank
that's a separate issue. Yeah.
you.
So, other questions? We've got 7 other people lurking on the call, but if there are no other questions, I'm not seeing other comments in the chat, and nobody else is jumping in. Um, I'll just say, thank you very much for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you perhaps at another SCORE workshop in the future. If you have any questions, sign up for a SCORE mentor who can work one-on-one with you to address your particular situation. And our services are free, and it's fun for us, so we're happy to help people out. So, um, it's not like you're imposing. We're doing it because it's fun. So, thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Have a wonderful day and stay warm.